Okay. What did he say?
I'd like to welcome everybody, and why don't we say together our defining statement? Kiwanis is a global organization of volunteers dedicated to improving the world, one child and one community at a time. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Clay, do we have a song?
If you go get your book, you go to page 40, and song 85, When the Saints Go Marching In. All right, I'll let you sing the first 4 lines. I'll take the next 4, and you'll join me after that. Oh, when the saints go marching in, oh, when the saints go marching in, yes, I want to be in that number when the saints go marching in. There was Aunt Matilda down in front, there was Sister Lucy too. I saw dear old Grandpa long since gone, the friends that we once knew. Oh, when the saints go marching in, oh, when the saints go marching in, yes, I want to be in that number when the saints go marching in. Yeah!
All right. Once again, as always, thank you, Clay. We have our invocation.
Thank you, June. I thought I would read Mahatma Gandhi's prayer for peace today. I offer you peace, I offer you love, I offer you friendship. I see your beauty, I hear your need, I feel your feelings. My wisdom flows from the highest source. I salute that source in you. Let us work together for unity and peace. Amen.
We're very pleased to welcome Howard Taylor to our club. Howard is sponsored by Sanford Bailey. And Sanford, would you like to come up and introduce him? And while they're coming up, as president, I would like to share the vision of Kiwanis with him. The vision of Kiwanis is to have a positive influence in communities worldwide, so that one day all children will wake up in communities that believe in them, nurture them, and provide the support they need to thrive. Having indicated a desire, Howard, to become an active member of our club, and having been approved by our board of directors as a member, and having gone through our club orientation, do you agree to embrace the vision of our club and the Kiwanis organization?
Yes, I do.
We welcome you to this global organization of volunteers dedicated to improving the world one child and one community at a time. And now, Sanford, would you please present Howard with his new membership pin?
Before I present him with the pen, let me tell you a little bit more about Howard, for those of you who have not had the opportunity to meet him. Of course, he'll be standing over at the table, and if all of you will go sign the apron after the meeting. But Howard has an interesting background. He was born in the Washington, D.C. area, grew up there, attended Iowa Wesleyan, played some football there as a linebacker. Later on, he went on to Boston University and graduated there with a degree in psychology. Over the years, Howard embarked in various business enterprises. More than anything else, he was involved in the clothing business. In particular, he was a licensee for Ralph Lauren, the Italian high-end clothes, and Adolfo and other Italian lines. He was in the clothing business a good while. Over the years, he has lived, in addition to the United States, and worked in the United States. He's lived in Europe and various places, also Central America and South America. He's retired now, of course, and during the latter part of his career, he was involved in building and managing shopping centers in South Florida a few years ago. So Howard and his wife, Yasmin, live in Wake Forest, and on behalf of the Kiwanis Club of Raleigh, I want to be the first to welcome you, Howard, to membership in this club.
Would you like to say anything, or can we just?
Basically a little bit shy now because I have some thing, but thank you all very much. I look forward to it.
Nice to have you. And I'll officially welcome you on behalf of the entire membership into the Kiwanis Club of Raleigh. We're delighted to have you. We have several guests with us today. Frances Bobby, we'll start with you. I don't know where you've ended up. She's gone. Okay. Jim Jenkins is her guest, and Jim, I think most everybody will know you. Could you just raise your hand? Nice to have you.
Well, folks, I am delighted to have with us today, and he's already said he's a prospective new member. He checked that box, and I think told him he's done for. This is Representative Phil Rubin. He is now in the House, representing House District 40. That was Joe John's seat, and he was appointed by the governor to fulfill that seat. I'll tell you a little bit about him. It's pretty impressive. He graduated magna cum laude from the University of Georgia, summa from Duke University School of Law. He served as Chief Judge of David Sintel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. He has been an Assistant United States Attorney for the Eastern District. Then he joined the North Carolina Department of Justice, and most recently he's been working with a private company doing online child safety and combating terrorism. Phil Rubin.
Thanks. Dan, would you please stand for us? Thank you. I'm thrilled to welcome for the third time today my friend Dan Martin. He is from Ocean Isle Beach. He's a UNC grad. He's been here in Raleigh a long time. Our kids have kind of grown up together and gone to preschool together. He works in finance and wealth management. For a long time, he managed a hedge fund, a large group, but recently he just went out on his own and is taking care of lots of his friends and family, amongst many others as well. So glad to have Dan here, and I'd love to give him a big welcome. Thanks.
And our last is Nick Fountain as a guest.
Welcome back, Nick.
Yes.
Thank you. Yep, thank you. I'm going to introduce Alma Zamora here, but before I do, I want to thank everybody for the cards and the letters and the emails and the phone calls and all that stuff. Really, a lot of you heard really warming. We got a great bunch of people here. I wanted to say thank you. It was watching the meetings on Zoom, watching you guys go get seconds on dessert, me get nothing. It's a whole lot better being here in person. But this card here, you know, I get these cards and go through the mail, and this one here from Phil Kirk, and I didn't even open it. I'd said to my wife, Julia, there's been a big mistake. Phil thinks I'm dead and is notifying you that he's just as relieved as you are. No, the truth is, lots of you have mentioned that how many times Phil Kirk has sent a card. And so, Phil, we thank you. If all the Republicans were more like you and maybe if some of the Democrats were more like me, we'd probably be getting a lot of stuff done. Anyway, so thank you all. You didn't know I fell down a flight of stairs and broke my ankle and leg in all 6 places. But today I'm in a hiking boot and without having to override the doctor. And I was able to drive a car for the first time since January the 2nd. So progress. I went into Truist Bank over on Blue Ridge the other day to tend to an estate matter and met Alma Zamora. She is the branch manager of that bank. And of course, her card says team leader, but we're going to probably have to do away with all the DEI and everything. We can't be inclusive anymore, so she'll probably have to go back to being branch manager. But anyhow, we got talking about her life, and it turned out that she was the child of immigrants who came to California and were successful in creating a farming operation coming from Mexico. Life brought her to North Carolina. She'd managed a business with electrical tools and equipment. But more than anything else, she'd been in banking for close to 30 years. And now she's the branch manager over here at Truist. So after some of that conversation, I said, so what do you do in the community? And she said, well, I teach financial literacy at Wake Tech up on the Beltline in Spanish for the Spanish community that's here in Raleigh. And I said, I do that for nothing, but these people need to know this stuff. I said, there are lots of them that are successful in business, but maybe got no Social Security number. They don't know how to write a check. They don't know any of that. I'm able to teach them all that and show them how you go about having a bank account and the like without a Social Security number and continue on with life. And so I said, well, you need to be at our Kiwanis Club. She said, give me the day, give me the time, and I'll be there. So she's here. She's a prospective member. Alma Zamora.
Welcome to you and all the guests. It's just a pleasure to be able to have you here.
Andy Wood is not able to be here today, but he asked me to make an announcement to all of you about the 35th annual golf tournament. We have set the date. It is going to be Thursday, May the 1st. It'll be at the Noose Country Club, just like it was last year. And Andy asked to put on your thinking cap about somebody who might be willing to take on the title sponsorship for the tournament this year. We haven't had anybody do that in the last couple of years, so if you know any organization that might be willing to be the title sponsor, let us know. Time to get your foursomes together, and volunteers will be talking with you in the weeks to come. So make May 1st on your calendar open for that tournament. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move to birthdays. Since we lost last Friday, we have a little more than we normally have. One, Sandra Burkhead had a birthday on the 20th. Christy Barbie had a birthday. Robert Ruiz. Wayne Goodwin, Gina Bunch, David Williams. I told you it was a long list. Bob Woodson, Andrew Perry, and that's it through the 28th.
I'm excited to introduce our speaker today. You all know him. He's a past member of our club. Rob Christensen, I guess you can come on up if you want. Okay, sorry, we're having a little trouble with this guy. I don't know what's going on with it, but can you hear me? That one's weird. Got a new book coming out this week, and this is, he's going to walk you all through it, but was a longtime political writer for the News and Observer. And it's going to be, his presentation today is going to be about, I guess, sort of the decline of the print newspaper, kind of told through this lens. Do I have that right?
Well, sort of.
Rise and fall. Well, I'll bring you on up. I'll let you do all the talking on that. Rob Christensen. I might also leave this with you, just because we're having a little trouble with this guy.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. As a former member, I know all the good works you're involved in, so, and I know a good number of people in this room, so it's a real pleasure to be here. Well, can you hear it? Whatever works. Okay. So, Josephus Daniels was the editor of the News Observer. Editor of the News Observer was a big Methodist, and he hated liquor. So when President Woodrow Wilson named him Navy Secretary, he decided to order liquor off all the ships. And as you know, drinking is such an ingrained tradition in the Navy that even some of the Navy slang to discuss drinking is widely known. For example, 3 sheets to the wind and binge and down the hatch, they're all Navy terms, right? So when it was his move to take the booze off the ships was very unpopular, and a group of naval officers appealed that decision to Secretary Josephus Daniels, and he rejected their appeal, and they said, well, the officer said, well, what should the men drink? And he said, the men should drink coffee. So in honor, quote unquote, of Josephus Daniels, they began calling coffee a cup of joe, and that is one of the origin stories for the term cup of joe. Now, my new book, Southern News and Southern Politics, is a history of the News and Observer and the 4 generations of the Daniels family that owned the paper for 101 years. And as a state capital paper, it circulated through most of eastern North Carolina, and it helped shape North Carolina's politics. Jim Hunt, the former 4-term governor of North Carolina, said the biggest influence on the state was the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, because it sent so many educated people to every little community across the state. But he said the second most influential institution over the years was the News and Observer. The NNO was a watchdog exposing scandals involving state government and labor unions and big-time college athletics, just to name a few. And it also was a cheerleader for the state's culture, promoting books and the arts, and you may remember the Friends of the College series. The NNO was a big promoter of that. Now, the NNO has a complex lineage, as a lot of newspapers do have. The NNO traces its roots back to 2 newspapers. The Observer, founded in 1876, and it merged with the Raleigh Sentinel, which was founded in 1865. So the News Observer first appeared as the News Observer on September 12, 1880. Now, Josephus Daniels purchased the NNO in 1894 when it was in financial trouble, and he made it the voice of the Democratic Party and the voice of white supremacy, and a crusading newspaper that fought the railroads, corporate interests, child labor, and anti-Semitism, while campaigning for public education, labor rights, and women's suffrage. Josephus Daniels was widely viewed by his white contemporaries as one of the South's most notable progressives. But it was a curious brand of liberalism. He was part of a group that conservative columnist Westbrook Pegler dubbed Jim Crow liberals. Now, that may be a difficult concept for many people today because the idea of social and racial justice have become so entwined with the idea of liberalism. But Daniels saw little contradiction between his liberalism on a broad range of issues and his ardently held segregationist beliefs. And he used his Raleigh newspaper to help inaugurate the era of Jim Crow, which sharply defined the political, economic, and social limits of black people. And he fueled vicious and sometimes deadly white supremacy campaigns of 1896, 1898, and 1900. There were 3 of them that worked to impose and uphold, and he worked to impose and uphold the state segregation laws until his death in 1948. He never really changed his views. The paper's rabid race baiting in 1898 certainly contributed to the Wilmington Massacre, all of which I deal with at some length in my book, which I won't deal with a whole lot today. Now, Daniels' use of racism was both personal and political. He was born in 1865 and grew up in Wilson, North Carolina, during a period of the cotton culture and where white supremacy views were mainstream. But it was also political. A Republican populist coalition had taken control of the state politics in 1894, and Daniels was determined to use race to oust the coalition and return the Democrats to power. Now, it was hard to tell whether Daniels was a newspaperman who engaged in politics or a politician who owned a newspaper. Such dual roles were not unusual in that era. Daniels became one of the top operatives of the state national Democratic parties. He was part of the American left, what historian Richard Hofstadter called the Age of Reform. The era included the populism of William Jennings Bryan, the progressivism of Woodrow Wilson, and the liberalism of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And Daniels was heavily involved in all three eras. He was intimate of Bryan and Wilson and Roosevelt. He was Bryan's right-hand man, he was Wilson's Secretary of the Navy, and he was FDR's ambassador to Mexico. Now, the News Observer began to move away from its blatant racism in 1933 when Josephus moved to Mexico City to begin 8 years as FDR's ambassador to Mexico. Now, Josephus had 4 sons, 3 of them involved in the paper. The most important was Jonathan Daniels, who took over as editor, and Frank Daniels Sr., who took over the business side. Jonathan changed the editorial tone of the News Observer on race, making it one of the more socially aware papers of the South. Now, it's hardly surprising that the father and son held different views on race. They were born in different centuries and had different upbringings. Said Jonathan, "I was always very much to the left of my father on the racial situation." In an age when most North Carolina black people could not vote, they were at the mercy of an all-white system, from the white cop on the beat to the judges, prosecutors, and white juries. And newspapers were one of the few entities that could bring public pressure on authorities for injustices. And Jonathan, the News Observer, was a voice against such injustices, frequently criticizing officials, police, prison officials for brutality, and against lynch mobs. But Jonathan was a gradualist, and support for racial change was not a straight line. He supported segregation even as he called for racial fairness. So changed was the News Observer's image on race that Jesse Helms in 1953 charged that the N&O had, quote, been selling out the South for at least 2 generations. So the newspaper's journey on race is just one of several stories that I tell in the book, although it's an important one. Now, in the early 1900s was an era of so-called yellow journalism, where newspapers were ultra-partisan, editors conducted personal journalism filled with insults, and facts were optional, a lot like social media today. If you ever saw the movie Front Page, you would get some idea how wild journalism was in that period. Josephus Daniels participated in fistfights on Fayetteville Street and even on the House floor of the Capitol. Reporters were valued as much as for their right hooks as for their writing style. One night, a drunken legislator stormed into the newsroom wielding a big bulldog pistol, demanding to see the reporter who offended him. The reporter, Billy Christian, who happened to be Stonewall Jackson's son-in-law, picked up a heavy chair and knocked the legislator senseless. Fearing that the lawmaker had been severely injured, the staffer fetched a doctor. Said the city editor, "Of all things we didn't want, it was a dead legislator. Such things are hard to explain." The News Observer so angered conservatives that in 1902, one Greensboro legislator proposed moving the state capital to Greensboro. He says, quote, "We are going to leave nothing to Raleigh but the penitentiary, the asylum, and Josephus Daniels." To which the News Observer responded with an editorial headlined, "3 institutions to keep Republicans straight." Now, Daniels was America's longest-serving Navy Secretary and one of the most controversial cabinet members of his generation. Daniels was best known for overseeing the Navy during World War I, and his deputy was FDR, who would call Daniels chief all his life. During World War I, Daniels banned all houses of prostitution around naval and marine bases, leading to Marine patrols and contentious efforts to shut down red light districts. The most famous was the Battle of New Orleans, when Daniels ordered the closure of Storyville, the city's fabled red light district. Storyville covered 28 blocks and gave employment to 750 women, countless jazz musicians from 7 p.m. till dawn. Because Storyville was one of New Orleans' major economic drivers, the mayor, Martin Berman, made 2 trips to Washington to try to change Daniels' mind. After meeting with Daniels, Berman told reporters, "You can make it illegal, but you can't make it unpopular." As Storyville closed at midnight on Daniels' deadline, prostitutes hauled away their belongings in wheelbarrows as a black jazz band played the hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee." From the 1930s until the 1960s, Jonathan was one of the moderate journalistic voices in the South, a best-selling author and a national figure. During World War II, both Jonathan and Josephus served in the Roosevelt administration. Josephus as ambassador to Mexico and Jonathan as a presidential aide and press secretary. The News Observer was one of the few strongly Democratic papers in the country. And this might surprise somebody. In 1936, only 1 out of every 7 papers endorsed FDR's reelection. FDR wanted to make Jonathan ambassador to New Zealand, but his nomination was vetoed by U.S. Senator Josiah Bailey, a conservative Democrat from Raleigh. Bailey was a longtime rival of the Daniels. When Jonathan was nominated ambassador, he went to see Senator Bailey, who said, "Young man, would you vote for my confirmation if I was appointed to some job?" And Jonathan replied, "If it were someplace far off," to which Bailey replied, "New Zealand isn't far enough off." Jonathan was a campaign speechwriter and drinking card and playing card buddy of President Harry Truman. He turned down Truman's offer to become Navy Secretary. Although the paper had become more professional under Jonathan, he did not see any conflict in helping favorite Democratic politicians such as Roosevelt, Truman, Carr Scott, Frank Porter Graham, Terry Sanford, and John F. Kennedy. When Jonathan retired in 1967 to Hilton Head, South Carolina to continue writing books, the family looked for a successor. The only journalist in the next generation was Derek Daniels, a grandson of Josephus who had grown up in Washington, D.C., the son of Worth Daniels, a physician. The family had tried to recruit him to the News Observer, but Derek was the family's glamour boy, famous for squiring attractive young women, for his drinking, and for smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day. Small-town life, which was what Raleigh was back then, held no appeal to Derek Daniels. Quote, and you'll like this quote, why he didn't want to be editor of News Observer. He says, "I couldn't have been happy living in Raleigh addressing the Kiwanis Club on Friday. I wouldn't fit in. I love big cities." He was the executive of night newspaper chain in Miami when Playboy founder Hugh Hefner named him president and chief executive officer of Playboy Enterprises, which his cousin Frank Jr. said was the perfect job for him. So for the first and only time during the Daniels era, the family hired an outsider, Claude Sitton, who was national editor of the New York Times. Sitton, a Georgia native, had been a legendary reporter for the Times, covering the civil rights movement, sometimes at great personal risk. Sitton introduced a new energy and level of professionalism into the newsroom, with an emphasis on government, politics, and investigations. Among other things, he hired Pat Stith, who would become a legendary investigative reporter. A Stanford University study found that Stith's investigations have resulted in the passage of 31 new laws and saved taxpayers millions of dollars. In 1996, Stith led a team writing about hog pollution in eastern North Carolina that won a Pulitzer Prize. There would be many other fine investigative reporters who would follow Stith's footsteps. Sitton, who won a Pulitzer Prize as an editor of the News Observer, made the News Observer a tough and feared newspaper. The News Observer's feud with Senator Jesse Helms, who got his start as a journalist on the staff of the News Observer, was famous. Helms had been hired as a WRAL-TV editorialist to be a conservative alternative voice to the News Observer. He variously described the paper and its editors as, quote, vicious, pious, left-wing propagandists, the voice of the far left, and accused them of engaging in demagoguery, ultra-liberal elitism, and sophomoric journalism. Otherwise, he liked the paper. But my favorite insult was after Helms was elected to the Senate, when he called the News Observer a suck-egg mule. The News Observer, of course, was a leading critic of Helms. Years later, Claude Sitton wondered whether all the criticism of Helms by the paper had been worth it, because it just made him that much more popular. When Frank Daniels Jr. retired as publisher in 1996, he received a letter from Helms written in Chinese. which is basically thank the paper for all the criticism that helped get him elected. Frank Daniels Jr. was the publisher's in the 1970s, and Josephus's grandson, deserves credit for much of the paper's success. He backed Sinton and oversaw the paper's growth and plowed much of the company's earnings back into the paper. He also kept the paper democratic. The paper didn't endorse a Republican until 1988, when it backed a Republican candidate for judge. Frank Jr. told the Kinston Rotary Club in 1989, "The NNO's social function is to play an adversarial role in relations to governmental and other public institutions, and to provide a voice not only for you and me, but also for those in our communities who, because they are economically or educationally deprived, have no forum or influence with government or business." When Sinton retired in 1990, Frank Jr. named his son, Frank Daniels III, as editor, returning the editorship to the family. And under Frank III, from 1990 to 1995, the News Observer greatly increased its budget and the size of the staff and won a coveted Pulitzer Prize. But Frank Daniels III saw how newspapers were in decline. He was one of the driving forces in convincing his father and the family to sell the paper in 1995, when it could still command top dollar. The family sold the paper for $372.6 million to the California-based McClatchy chain. The timing was perfect. Amazon billionaire Jeff Bezos bought the much larger Washington Post for $250 million in 2013, much less than the NNO went for. Under McClatchy, the newspaper was headed by professional newspaper managers who had worked their way up the system: Anders Gyllenhaal, Melanie Sill, John Drescher, Robin Tomlin, Bill Church. In 2000, the paper got its first black publisher in Orange Quarles. The paper had had a steady arc of improvement until the industry collapsed. In 1999, for example, the News Observer was named the 16th best newspaper in the country in a survey of 100 U.S. editors, even though it was only the country's 67th largest paper. In the South, only the St. Petersburg Times and the Dallas Morning News were ranked higher. Newspapers, the printed page delivered to doorsteps, were essentially a product of 19th and early 20th century, the industrial age, and they struggled to survive in the new information age. The speed of the technological revolution was breathtaking beginning in the late 1990s. In what turned out to be a disastrous bet, McClatchy newspapers in 2006 doubled down on the old media, purchasing the much larger Knight Ridder newspaper chain for $4.5 billion and assuming a $2 billion debt. The move put the chain deeply in debt just as the industry was collapsing. During the 21st century, the newspaper industry has lost more jobs than coal mining. The News Observer staff went from 260 journalists in 2002 to 69 in 2022, and that included the staff from the Durham Herald-Sun when it added that paper. And the cutbacks had an impact on what it could cover. Newspapers live and die on their advertising, with the News Observer earning $4 in advertising for every $1 it collected in subscriptions. The paper's advertising loss had a catastrophic impact on revenue. The paper shrank from 127 pages on July 1, 2000, to 84 pages a decade later, to 24 pages on the same date in 2020. Compensating for the loss of advertising revenue, the paper continually hiked subscription costs. The subscription price rose by tenfold from between the year 2000 and the year 2024, and subscribers abandoned the papers in droves. And by 2021, the paper had only about 1/3 of the print subscribers that it had in 2006. This was all happening, by the way, in a wealthy, fast-growing Sunbelt region. There are numerous examples of the decline of watchdog journalism. Often there are now no reporters at city or town council meetings or at county commissioner meetings, not only in Raleigh but also in other surrounding communities. There was little screening of Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, perhaps the most flawed candidate ever to rise in North Carolina politics. And the newspaper turned to algorithms in planning their coverage, counting the number of clicks on a story or on its website. As a result, for example, in 2020, there were more articles in the News Observer about the coming opening of the new Wegmans grocery store than there were about the Raleigh mayor's race. Historian Jill Lepore has written, "There have been great newspapers and there have been lousy newspapers, but the Republic has never known a time without newspapers, and it was by no means clear that the Republic could survive without them, or at least without the freedom of the press on which we're established, the floor on which civil society stands. The News Observer has been both a great paper and a lousy paper, both. The N&O was never a beloved paper, often called by its critics the nuisance and disturber. It was a liberal paper circulating in a largely conservative area. But having a state capitol paper as an aggressive watchdog should not be undervalued. For decades, the paper uncovered misdeeds by public officials, dug up scandals in the sports programs of major state universities, discovered shenanigans among labor leaders, and spotlighted miscarriages of justice. And the paper was often excoriated for doing so. When asked by one of his appointees what was expected of him, Democratic Governor Greg Cherry, who served in the 1940s, replied, "I want you to do your job and don't do anything that you don't want to read about on the front page of the News Observer the next morning." Cherry's advice could serve as the paper's epitaph. I'd be glad to take any questions if we have time. And also, I'd be remiss to say that I have lots of books over here if anybody's interested in buying a book. So are there any questions, or do we have time for questions? I don't have an idea, but the trend for many regional newspapers like News Observer is to go online, and it's already online for Saturday, as you probably know, and I think that's probably where papers are headed, because it's you know, the whole process of, I get my paper that way too. I'm a very tactile person. I read my books on paper. I don't read them online, that sort of thing. I like to hold something in my hand, but you know, that's fewer and fewer people are going to be like you and I.
You mentioned the 1898, I guess you'd call it a Wilmington massacre.
Yeah.
Why has the state of North Carolina to this day not formally apologized about that?
Well, I thought the legislature did, but I could be mistaken.
I don't think they have.
And the News Observer did. They ran a big special section.
Because the News Observer at that time was kind of at least partially responsible for that. Is that accurate?
So it had, yes, it's basically accurate. It did not call for the massacre, but it started a racial wildfire across the state, and one of the results was the Wilmington massacre. So News Observer didn't really circulate in Wilmington. It was Wilmington papers, but News Observer bears some responsibility for that because they whipped up racial fear and hatred all across the state for political reasons.
So let me ask you this. The Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, has decided apparently that he's not going to try to cover both sides of all the issues. The News Observer for many years had op-ed sections, had its own stuff with its point of view. But in thinking about media, Bezos said in connection with making that decision to get alternative views online, and it was no point in the Washington Post carrying those kinds of things. But as a longtime media person, I'm curious what you think about how are people like us supposed to get news curated to give us a balanced point of view so that we can decide what we think personally.
So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that Bezos' decision, which I find troubling, applied only to their op-ed page, but that did not mean that their news pages would be affected. So that certainly is troubling. Claude Sitton, when he was editor, was a little bit that way. He really did not want to run op-ed pieces by conservatives. And the whole point of having an op-ed page is so that other people, you get all points of view in the community. And so you certainly want some diversity there, diversity in opinion on those pages. So that's very troubling. It's really a throwback to the way newspapers used to be. That, they were, newspaper, you had liberal newspapers, and you often had two newspapers in a town. One would be a conservative, one would be a liberal. And I remember the National Tennessee, they had, for example, they had the National Tennessean was the liberal paper, and the National Banner was the conservative paper, and they couldn't agree on anything. But they shared the same building, because they had an operated agreement to work together to put the paper out and so forth. And they didn't agree on daylight savings time. So if you were, and they had on the top of the building, they had a couple clocks. So if you were walking in one direction toward the newspaper, it'd be one time. But if you were walking on the other direction, controlled by the other newspaper, it was a different hour. So you couldn't even tell the time by walking down the street in Nashville. Well, so they weren't fighting during my time, but newspapers are always very loud. I remember when I was transferred up to be the paper's Washington correspondent, I had my own office. I had a hard time writing and concentrating because there wasn't all this new noise and shouting and people kicking cans and all that sort of thing. It was like the silence was just, I couldn't think without all that noise. But the fist fights and stuff were the early part of the News Observer, and there were. There was one story about one News Observer reporter got really ticked off. It was these feuds would be going on, and some legislator insulted the News Observer reporter. So the News Observer got a gun and went looking for the legislator, and was shooting at him. It was the old Park Central Hotel, which used to be on the corner of Martin Street and McDowell. And the guy fled up the upstairs, and the reporter was shooting at him as they went up there. And then of course that was reported to the police, and so they got him. They got the reporter out on the train out of town, so to avoid being arrested, until things could blow over a couple of days, and they brought him back, and they said it'd be fine because the police force was all Democratic, and it was anyway. But so it was pretty rough back then. There was Josephus Daniels wrote some story, his paper put in some stories about, and he wrote some columns on this. I think a Northampton County prison official, superintendent, who was using inmates for his own farm and that sort of thing. And when Josephus, who was from down east, was on the train, the superintendent found out about it and went looking for him with his gun out. And Josephus, who never carried a gun, hid in the men's room as the guy went through the car after car looking to shoot Josephus. So it was pretty raucous.
I have one last question. You have your book release is on Tuesday at Quail Ridge, is that right? Is that open to the public, or do you have to buy a spot for that?
That is open to the public, yeah.
Okay,
Sure.
so do you know what time that is?
At 7 o'clock, 7 p.m. Yeah, so you're getting like an advanced preview here tonight, or this afternoon. So, thank you.
As usual, we present a children's book to Read and Feed, and it's an after-school program that provides meals, tutoring, and books to children from low-income families in Wake County. So in honor of you, we would like for you to sign it. You can take it to your seat and sign it, and we'll pick it up. And thank you again for being here today. This has been wonderful. Thank you. And we're thrilled with all of our guests, Jim Jenkins and Phil Rubin, and I'm not sure I'm going to say this right, Alma Zimmerman, nice to have you here, and Dan Martin. Please come back and join us. We're glad to have you here, and I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend. Thank you.